to Hit the Reset. Today's episode focuses on a word we hear everywhere, but rarely pause to truly understand it: longevity. Longevity isn't merely about adding years to your life, it's about extending our contribution, continuing to work if you wish, to keep learning, and to remain relevant, curious, and connected far beyond the old notion of retirement. To help us unpack what longevity really means, globally and personally, I'm delighted to be joined by Annie Coleman. She has a resume that reads like several lifetimes in one. She has navigated the halls of political power with Margaret Thatcher and led the people strategy for one of Europe's largest banks. Annie is now the founder and CEO of RealiseLongevity and an ambassador for the Stanford Center on Longevity. Annie works at the intersection of people, process, and policy, helping us rethink how we design life in an age where living to 90 or even 100 is no longer an exception. In this conversation, we'll talk about what's being done, what still needs to change, and how each of us can prepare not just to live longer, but to live better. Annie, welcome to Hit the Reset. Thank you for your time.
Delighted to be here, Mally. I'm really looking forward to this.
Before we deep dive into longevity and the big global ideas, wanted you to share something about yourself that doesn't show up in your LinkedIn profile, but says a lot about who you are.
Oh, that's a really good way of starting something. So one of my passions in life, outside my longevity work, which I absolutely love, it doesn't feel like work at all, but I absolutely passionate about wine. So I've studied wine, I've worked in a vineyard, I have a wine cellar in my house, I often throw wine tastings. I've invested in it. For me, it's just the most glorious, glorious thing, wine. I think Galileo once said that wine can be described as sunlight held together by water, and which I think is a beautiful description. And what I love about wine is that the same grapes grown in a different place, different soil, different climate can produce such a completely different tasting wine. You can have the same bottle of wine, the same vintage, and you can open it on one day with one group of friends, or you can open it on another day with another group of friends. And again, that somehow seems to transform how it actually tastes. So it's absolutely amazing. And to link it back to longevity, neuroscience say that actually one of the best ways of staving off dementia is actually wine tasting, because you use so many of the senses. You have to look at the color and decide, what that is. You have to smell it. You then obviously have to taste it. And then you have to use your hippocampus, your memory, to connect all those things and try and remember what the name of the wine is or what the vintage is, etc. So you're using so many of your senses. So that's another good excuse to be passionate about wine.
Another way of connecting to longevity is, wine tastes better as it ages.
That's true too. Yes, that's a very good point. Very good point.
And you spent quite a number of decades in the highest levels in the global financial sector. Many reach that summit and think, I'm done, right? But you decide to hit your own reset button. So what was the moment you realized your third chapter needed a different script?
So it's interesting. I had kind of like two reset buttons, actually. So very briefly, I was in my early 50s and I'd been working for myself for 4 or 5 years. And I thought, now in my 50s, no one's ever going to employ me again. This is how I'm going to, live my life. I'm just going to work as a freelance project person. And then I got approached about a role at UBS, which I was really surprised at. And I think that's one of the things, is that we can sometimes internalize ageism and think, write ourselves out of the script when we're still actually really valuable. And I went back into the corporate world. And then that next decade became my highest earning and most productive period of my career. I think what really, really hit the proper reset button, though, was when I must have been about 61. And I just felt that I wanted to be able to do things on my terms, in a rhythm that I wanted, as opposed to the rhythm that the organization wanted. well, what am I going to do? Because I'd planned to go traveling. That was the big idea. I thought, I'll work out what I'm going to do with my life by doing this fantastic trip. And, as I'm traveling around, I'll kind of figure it all out. Big mistake. Don't ever do that. Don't leave it too late. So anyway, I was sitting in this room thinking, what, another 20, 30 years of this? And I just thought, I really do now to really sort of spend some time figuring this out. And so I started reading books and doing various courses. I then went actually back into the corporate world because I think I hadn't really figured out my identity in this reset and who I was. And so in a way, it was more comforting to go back into what was familiar. But I did it for just over a year, and I promised I wasn't going to do it longer than that because I had a inkling in the back of my head that actually being back in the corporate world wasn't what I really wanted to do. And sure enough, and after a year, I found someone else to take my role. And that's when I then realized that, no, this was a proper reinvention that I really had to focus on. And I really had to give this proper time. And the thing about resets or transitions, which I think is really important, is that a transition or a reset actually starts with an ending, paradoxically. So it starts with an ending. You then go through this kind of like messy middle where you're trying to figure out what is it you really want to do. And that can be months, years for some people. And then eventually you do end up with a new beginning, something that really does kind of engage you and you really want to focus your time on. But you've got to deal with that ending first before you can do the new beginning. And I think that's what I found really helpful was when I got into that kind of mindset.
I think a lot of us from the corporate space go through the same thing. And since both of us have been in the corporate space, although they say that 60 is the new 40, in the corporate space, sometimes 50 feels like the new 80. So how did your former colleagues react when you told them that you were going to help people plan 100-year lives?
So I think a lot of people do want to have some support because one of the great gifts of life today is that we are living much longer. I mean, it is an extraordinary phenomenon. So most of us are living an extra 30 odd years. But that's a life stage that has not been available to maybe our parents or grandparents. So we're pioneering a new life stage that people haven't experienced. And there aren't very many roadmaps and there aren't very many role models. And so I think a lot of people struggle with, they finish their corporate career, they maybe, take their retirement, and then it suddenly dawns on them, but I've got 30 years. That's quite a long time. I can't just be traveling or doing sports or whatever it is. I need to have something more in my life to be really happy. And there's lots of evidence to show that actually having something meaningful in your life, as well as really strong social connections, is the Harvard study on adult development has shown this, is that's a much better indicator of whether you're going to live a long, healthy and happy life than wealth or status. And so I think a lot of people, first of all, thought, well, that's a sort of curious thing to do. But I think as people are becoming more aware just about how much longer they're going to live after they've actually left the corporate world, a lot more people, I think, are wanting that support and help, that roadmap and those role models to give them something to follow.
Yeah. Yeah. I talk about this to a lot of my friends who have retired. And the first thing is, I'm going to travel. And I said, okay, I'll come back after 1 year and talk to you because that's going to fade away after some time. You need that purpose or anchor, as you mentioned, to keep you going. Looking beyond your personal journey, Annie, you're now at the forefront of the longevity revolution, if we may call it that. So help us demystify longevity. What are we actually experiencing globally and the reality of what's changed and what's coming?
Sure. So first of all, a lot of people think longevity is about biohacking and, living as long as you can. That to me is not longevity. Longevity for me is more about how we add life to those extra years. And it's also about how do we ensure that those extra 30 years that we've been given are as happy and meaningful as they can be. And for that, we need to have enough finances to give us economic choices. We need to have those social connections so that we feel that we have a sense of belonging. We certainly need to have our health. There's no point living longer if we're in really poor health. But it's also having something meaningful so that, we feel our lives matter. So for me, longevity is about how do we put that in place. One of the challenges, let's have a look at what's driving it, because it's really about demographics. And I think the thing about demographics is they're facts, they're not forecasts. And the facts are that certainly in the Western world, it's slightly different in places like India and places like that. But in places like Western world, America, certainly China, Japan, and even Singapore, people are living longer, and say that is a incredible phenomena, but we've also got declining birth rates. And so in places like Japan, it's only like the ratio is 1.2, which basically means that there's only just over one child being born for every couple. And that's not replacing quickly enough the number of people who are actually dying. So basically you have a shrinking population. What it also means is that because you've got such a now, something like over 30% of people in Japan are over the age of 65. And so what happens is you've got an increasingly dependency ratio. And what by that I mean, you've got a lot of older people, you've got a shrinking number of people being born. So the working population is also shrinking. And of course, they're the people that pay the taxes, that pay for the healthcare and pay for the pensions. And so that becomes a real economic challenge for governments. And it's why so many governments around the world keep raising the age of retirement. But that in itself isn't enough. And so I think one of the things around longevity is that it really requires systems change, because we're living lives today, longer lives built on systems for much shorter lives. So, for example, I'll go back to the UK. Pensions that the pensions we have today were invented in the 90s. And the idea was that you worked and you took your pension in your early 60s, but most people died about 7 or 8 years later. So you only had your pension for a short period of time. Now, as we said, you can retire in your 60s and live another 30 years. That's just not sustainable for governments to be able to fund that. And so people also need to think very differently. And it's not so much, I think retirement's a terrible word. It actually means to withdraw, to step back. Whereas I actually think, this second chapter that we've been given is almost an opportunity to sort of, reinvent yourself. And that's the opportunity. So there are challenges, but there are also opportunities. And I think one of the big challenges at the moment is that there are an awful lot of people who retire or stop work, realize they don't have enough money. So, for example, over a third of people in the UK are actually wanting to unretire. They want to go back because they realize they need more money, but they also miss that social connection that I mentioned earlier that work gives them, and that sense of meaning. So there's an awful lot of people who want to unretire. There's an awful lot of people who want to work much later than official retirement. So you've got a lot of supply, but you don't have the demand from organizations, because organizations still have very, very stereotypical thinking around older and more mature workers. They still think younger will work harder, the younger better at technology, that, older people don't want to learn new skills. All completely wrong. But that, unfortunately, is the stereotypes that still drives an awful lot of the way that companies think. And so companies really do need to rethink the way they manage their workforces and career paths, etc., because governments alone can't fix this problem. And I think companies really need to wake up to the fact that the experience and the wisdom that they have with those older workers is really worth retaining. And again, there's been some fascinating studies. There was one done by 2 American scientists that came out in November last year called Intelligence. And they have done these studies which look at cognition over about 16 different categories, but basically cognition in its broader sense. And what they discovered is that actually people reach their peak cognition in their 50s and 60s, just at the point when most organizations are thinking, these people are too expensive, we need to move them out. So they're losing this incredible amount of experience and wisdom. And at a time when so many companies are trying to implement AI, they really need that wisdom and experience to actually, input into the AI, because without that, you are missing that huge amount of institutional knowledge that's held by those more mature workers.
Yeah. So a friend and I are building a platform which is primarily to get people back into the workspace. So people above 50. And we realized that awareness is very, very low in the corporate side. And as you rightly said, this is a gold mine that needs to be tapped. And people appreciate what we're doing, but they haven't moved an inch to say, okay, we're going to hire these people back into the workspace. So that is, I'm going to talk to you about the corporate sector a bit later. So I loved the phrase that you said. You said purpose is the new pension. I think that says it all, right? So it's a good way of putting it in. You worked across continents, and then just wanted to understand if there's a different approach to longevity, as you rightly said, say in Japan versus UK versus Australia.
Sure.
I'm talking about the holistic approach, and what is it that we can learn from these cultural differences?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that Japan in particular is sort of leading the way, if you like, in
Yes.
terms of having an older generation. But I think that the corporate world is beginning to realize more about the need for retention of older workers. So I think we can learn. So for example, I heard a story about a company that was a sort of gas installation company in Tokyo. And what happened is that they had a retirement cliff in their company, a bit like we have a lot in the UK now, where an awful lot of people all left the company at the same time. And they then realized they didn't have the technical knowledge that would enable them to maintain the infrastructure of their gas business. And they had to rehire all these people back in. And they now become mentors and coaches to the younger generation to help them with that. And they're actually saving an awful lot of money on training and development costs because they're using their people. So I think Japan is pioneering some interesting new things that we could learn from. So that's sort of Japan. And Singapore's also doing some very interesting things. One of the things about longer lives, it also requires us to become lifelong learners.
Yes.
We have to reskill much more readily and quickly than in previous generations. And Singapore actually provides a credit for learning, which I think is really, really interesting. Yeah. And I think actually could be something that other countries also look at adopting this credits to go towards incentivizing you to keep that lifelong learning and reskilling. In the UK, a third of our workforce is over 50. So we share very similar issues to Singapore and Japan. And we have a particular, in the next kind of like 10 years, what I call real retirement cliff issue, where a lot of baby boomers are all deciding to leave the sort of corporate world at the same time. And I don't think that companies really understand the risks. And I also think that institutional investors ought to be probing this a lot more when they come to kind of like looking at kind of not just DE&I, but also the whole human capital aspect of businesses, because there are huge risks there. And when it comes to Australia, I talked to people in the longevity space there, very, very similar issues. Culturally, I think Australians are much more attached to literally finishing work at 65. It's kind of like, that's it, I'm done. But they have a much better superannuation pension scheme. So they mandate people put in at least 12% of their earnings into their pensions. And so people by and large tend to have better pensions when they do retire than they do, for example, in the UK. And Europe tends to have better pensions too than we have in the UK. So that's why, for example, in France, there were outcries when the French government tried to increase the pension age there, and the French were not having it at all. But they've got a better support system in place. Nonetheless, they still suffer from the same issues around declining birth rates and this shrinking workforce. So they are very similar issues. But the outliers really are places like India and Indonesia, who've still got these very young populations. But I think, they can be learning from some of the things that we're struggling from, because it will come eventually to those places too.
Which is so true, because if you again go back to Singapore, every year they've been increasing the retirement age. And besides the skills future, the learning bit, and Workforce Singapore is to provide job opportunities. They're integrating age-friendly design into community, into urban planning. Housing is a big focus. And you actually see it happening, in terms of fitness, wellness. You see people, the older generation, literally exercising and doing all that. So the interesting part is it's not just a policy, it's being executed fantastically as well. So I think that's something that, as you rightly said, the other countries need to adapt with them.
Yeah.
Just moving on, you often make reference to people, policy, and processes. So if we start with people, how is the longevity shift hitting the senior professionals? Are they reinventing themselves at 60 or just extending the same old playbook?
So I think many people are struggling to find a new playbook. But I think what a lot of people are realizing is that there is a whole kind of transition, a new identity that they have to find. And that identity shift, I
Yes.
think, be it your children leaving home, being it leaving a corporate career, but it tends to happen people at this age. And I think it's people struggling to think, who do I want to be
Mm.
now in this kind of like second adulthood that I've got? And I think, there's a mindset shift.
Yes.
So I think, as I said, I think we can internalize ourselves. Oh, I'm too old to start doing something new, or you can't teach old dogs new tricks. It's absolute rubbish. You can do whatever you want to do. So I think we have to get rid of that mindset. And again, the reason for having a positive attitude towards aging, again, Becca Levy at Yale University done this fascinating study. And she's shown that if you have a positive attitude towards aging, you can add 7.5 years to your life. So get the mind shift. That's really important. And then I think it's really about finding out, as we've discussed earlier, finding out a reason for getting out of bed. I say pension will keep the lights on, but purpose gets you out of bed. And so you've got to have that reason for getting out of bed. And it doesn't have to be this kind of like purpose with a big capital P that, so many people talk about. Just think about doing something purposefully. That's what you really need to do, because that really makes the difference. And then, if even in your 60s, I would get people to prioritize their health in terms of thinking about, what are the things you love to do that you want to continue to be doing in your 70s and 80s? And you really should be prioritizing the movements and the nutrition and all of that that's going to help you do that in the future. And then it's also about, having those social connections. So often when we leave the corporate world, a lot of the friendships get left behind. And so it's really important to think about, who are the people that really light you up, and really spend time investing in those relationships, the ones that you want to continue having in 10, 20 years time. I think that's a really important thing to be doing in this moment too. And so, yeah, really focusing on those things is really what the people part of this all has to do.
Mm.
And also, I think, thinking about how you can maybe do sort of, side hustles, to supplement your pension if you haven't got enough money. So are there things that you love to do that you could turn into sort of like a mini part-time business, or something in your community? I think it's that kind of mindset to experiment and try out new things, I think, so important when it comes to people in this transition phase. But rewire, don't retire, is my message.
But it's not as easy as we make it to be, right? Because especially if you're in the corporate space for about, say, 20, 25 years, you step out and you get this feeling you've lost your identity. There was the
Yeah.
CEO of a big multinational company said, I stopped going to social events because I didn't know who to introduce myself as, and there's a fear of rejection saying, they liked me because I was the CEO, but now, are they going to accept me as an individual? So all these things go on. It takes a long time to internalize that before you even step out and decide to do what you want to do.
Yeah, it's so true. I was coaching a CFO of a very large business, and he said to me, he said, people don't ring me anymore. And he said, but I've worked out that, people used to ring me, but it was my title they were ringing, not me, the person. And, that was a kind of like, again, like a real identity shock for him. And that's often what people go through when they do decide to leave work, is that, first of all, there's that honeymoon phase of, yes, I've got no structure. I've got an empty calendar. Oh, I can just do what I want to do. I can travel. And as you say, after about a year, 18 months, it suddenly kind of hits them and I call it an identity quake. It's like, oh my goodness, who am I? What am I going to do? Suddenly that empty calendar looks
Mm.
really kind of like desperate and horrible. How am I going to fill my time? And for some people, it can be a really dark time,
Yeah.
of decline and depression, and really, really challenging. And I always say to people, just try new things. And yes, a lot of them you're going to fail at, but you'll learn something in the process. But if you keep experimenting and you keep trying, eventually you will find things that you suddenly think, you know what, I actually really enjoy doing that.
Mm.
I think we have to kind of get out of it is getting out the ego out of the way,
Yes.
that I was this and now I need to be something else. And I actually think giving back and mentorship can
Mm.
often be a really, really good way of making that transition, because people have got an incredible amount of wisdom and judgment, and young people are in desperate need of it.
Yes.
So,
From a policy perspective, if you had a magic wand to change one policy globally to support senior professionals and aging population, what would it be? And where are the governments getting it right and where are they failing spectacularly?
well, I think this is a massive, massive problem.
Mm.
Um, the trouble is that we live our lives on this three-stage model, which is education, work, retire. That's no longer fit for purpose in a 100-year life.
Yeah.
So what a 100-year life is going to look like, and over 50% of children, but certainly born in the UK, are going to live to 100. So what it means is that, you're going to have to work a lot longer into your 70s, possibly 80s, but you can't do that at the pace that you and I used to work. That's just not sustainable.
True.
And so we're going to have a multi-stage way of being. So that means that, you will be, you'll get educated, you'll then maybe work for a bit, you'll then maybe take some time off to travel or do a passion of yours. You'll come back, you'll reskill, you'll go and work somewhere else. You then might decide to start a family. You take time off for that. You then go back into the workplace, do some other different career, maybe have a portfolio way of working where you're doing maybe 2 or 3 different things. You may then leave the workplace again. It's going to be much more multi-staged. That means that we have to change our education systems. That means we have to change the way companies are organized and how they organize workforces and career pathways. That means pensions have to change, because you may want to dip into your pension pot at different times during that multi-stage, not just have it at the end. It's not about adding these extra 30 years to the end of our life. It's weaving them in throughout. And that requires such fundamental changes to the way that we live and work. And I think we're only just beginning to start that. If I could make one change,
Mhm.
I would actually, certainly in the UK, I would actually. It sounds very small, but I think it's really important. I would have pension credits for particularly women who take time out of work for caring for families or older people, because at the moment in the UK, women, when they retire, have 36% less in their pensions, private pensions, than men, because they've given up this time, and they also live longer. So it's a double whammy. So we have got the possibility of an awful lot of women actually living on the poverty line because they do not have enough money to fund those longer lives. And I think pension credits for anyone, it could be male or female, who's taken time out for caring duties would make a really big difference to that. So that would be probably the one thing that I particularly would change. But it requires changes across so many different parts
It's true.
of the way that we live. I mean, housing is another thing too. There have been some really interesting experiments done in the UK. There's one little community that's been developed just outside Cambridge, and they have developed this housing estate which basically is enclosed, so kids can ride on their bicycles and play outside, and it's completely safe. It's got a mixture of intergenerations living together. So some of the older people look after the younger kids when the parents are out working. They have communal eating and social areas. You can stay in your own house, but there are also communal areas where you can come together to eat. They share art classes, they share activity classes together, but it's bringing all those intergenerations together. And I think that is also going to be needed in the future, because otherwise we're becoming too polarized and too age segmented. And actually, there's so much more richness in life when we can bring those generations together. The other thing that I think I would do would be policy to create new housing around these kind of models.
Which is so interesting. In India, they had these senior homes where, if you're above a certain age, you can get a home. And what they figured out over a period of time is people of that age, probably two generations or one generation away, they're only talking about aches and pains. You're talking about, so it gives you a negative feeling because you're surrounded by everyone who's talking about age related issues. So now they build homes, they build apartments, and one tower is dedicated to the senior citizens, which means that they have their space, but there's a lot of common area and they interact with people from multiple generations, as you rightly said. So that seemed to work slightly better than isolating them and putting them into a separate home, right? So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Much better way of being. And I certainly wouldn't want to kind of, just live on my own with people my own age. I love that diversity of people and ages. That's what makes it so much more interesting.
I know. So that takes us to the next question. In terms of processes, I think we're seeing five generations in the workplace for the first time ever, right? What's the most innovative approach you've seen to make this actually work? Are there some examples of how companies are incorporating this?
Yeah. So you're right. So most companies now are what I say multi-generational by default,
Uh,
but very few are intergenerational by design.
okay.
And what I mean by that is that very few companies intentionally bring different ages together. But actually, that's again where the magic happens. So, again, I think it's BCG and a couple of other companies. When you can bring that crystallized intelligence together with the fluid intelligence of younger people. And by that, I mean the sort of the street marts, the innovative way of looking at things because they don't have all that experience getting in the way. So they just, they can be very creative, but maybe not very practical. When you bring those crystallized and fluid intelligence together, that's when you get enhanced innovation, enhanced productivity. So much more comes out of it than having people working in their own segregated ages. And so for me, that's where bringing those two together really does happen. Now, there are some companies where it kind of happens organically. So British Telecom, one of our big telecom companies, I know somebody who is in a team where he's got all five ages in one team. And he very much kind of like works around, intentionally kind of getting ideas from everybody around that. And they've got sort of older people working out in the field because sometimes, older people who've got broadband issues want to talk to an engineer who's actually similar in their age, but sometimes they want younger people. So they deliberately do mix it up. But I think there is a danger that, people don't actually think about intentionally bringing those people together. And that's when you get the sort of ageism that creeps into organizations too, because when you bring into people intentionally together, you can then see the best of each other. And I think if you've got a particular project or a particular issue that you want solving, intentionally bringing people together is actually one of the best ways of doing that. And so that's what I recommend to all companies is they actually find particular projects or challenges or opportunities and then literally do create those teams. The other thing that I think is good practice, and we certainly did it where I worked at UBS, is that and it's becoming more popular now, is that we actually got high-performing younger people to reverse mentor the people in the most senior roles. Because again, we all have blind spots. We've been brought up in a different generation, and we do see things differently. And having younger people, really bring that into relief and being able to explain that and show that to us can be incredibly useful. And of course, they benefit from the mentoring and the wisdom of the more experienced people. So that, doing that, it also can be hugely beneficial. And a lot of companies now will have a sort of second executive team made up of younger people who they then kind of like get them to, well, look, this is our strategy. Well, how do you see it through the lens of, your generation? And I think that's really healthy.
Do you see a lot of companies adapting to this as yet, or it's still in the nascent stage?
I still think it's early stages, but certainly the reverse mentoring I think's been around for a while. But I think the being more intentional about bringing teams together, I think is becoming, as people are beginning to realize the benefits of it, is becoming more the norm. But it's still, I still think people just need to be more intentional about it rather than it just happening,
Yeah, since we've touched upon the corporate space, as a former CHRO, you've seen both sides of hiring decisions, right? What's the one thing companies are missing out by not hiring or retaining the seniors who are pivoting? Do
Yeah,
they
so
understand what they're missing out?
So I think several things really is one, particularly, the world of finance, it's always kind of like relied on that input of young talent coming in. Well, demographics mean it's just not going to be there any longer. And the cost of hiring somebody and training somebody is actually much more expensive than
True.
hanging on to experienced talent. And I just think again that an awful lot of organizations have stereotypical thinking. So they just literally stop investing in training and development for older people and then worry then say, well, they're just disengaged. Well, is that any surprise if you're not investing in them?
True.
And they don't value that wisdom and experience. And as I said earlier, it's, people are at their kind of like peak performance in many ways in that years 50 to 60. And ageism, unfortunately, is rife in organizations as well as in society. And again, they're considered to be, say, not able to learn, they're too expensive. I think it's beginning to change. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do is to highlight those companies who are doing things different. They have set up something called Bosch Management System, and it's basically support. And it's an in-house consulting group made up of people who've retired, but who've got fantastic expertise. They come into this consulting area on flexible contracts, and then they're put out into the business to help them with particular challenges or opportunities. So they've really realized that tapping into that wisdom and experience can make a huge difference. So I think that's a really interesting model. EasyJet, which is one of our kind of budget airlines around Europe, they've just had a recruitment campaign for the last 3 or 4 years where they've only wanted to hire people over the age of 50. So they say in their recruitment, we want people over the age of 50 because we realize that, you're better in a crisis, you're calmer, you've got that wisdom, your experience. And so the cabin crew that they are hiring all over the age of 50, but they're also smart enough to realize that the people who are doing most of the traveling to these remote airports all around Europe tend to be older people. So they're matching the people that are serving them with the customers that they're serving, which is also super smart. I think another one, and I think this is probably one of the most interesting models about how processes need to change within organizations, is Unilever. So they created something called U-Work. And it's like having a sort of a gig economy, but within the organization. So what happens is if you want flexible working, and it was designed for people sort of 50, 60 plus, because most people may not want to work as hard as they have, but they want to continue working maybe in a more flexible way. And they recognize that. And so with U-Work, you basically have a contract with the company. They pay you a certain amount every month. It's not like you were earning before, but you get paid a certain amount every month. You keep your health benefits and your pension, but you then decide when you want to work and on what projects. And so you might go for a month without doing anything, or you then might decide you're going to work full time on a project for, say, 6 months. But it's the retention of those pension and health benefits whilst you're on this kind of contract that really makes the difference.
Yeah. Tell me, what's the hardest conversation we are not having about longevity? What's the elephant in the room? Is it inequality, care costs, intergenerational tension, purpose in later life?
I think, I always talk about longevity rather than aging, because I think one of the things is that one of the hardest things is that we tend to see aging as decline, whereas longevity sounds a lot more
Positive.
kind of optimistic. And this is really about extending possibilities. That's what I think longevity is all about. It's not extending age, it's extending possibility.
Yeah.
I think the elephant in the room is that we don't admit that we are ageist and that we have an ageist society. It actually, it's something unconsciously a lot of us even do. I mean, I've even had to check myself, when I've seen maybe a photograph of Jane Fonda and I say, my God, doesn't she look good for her age? I mean, that is being ageist. And I think it's behoven on all of us to check, are we being ageist internally ourselves and with others? And ageism isn't just about old people. It's also about young people. A brilliant person who was passed over for a leadership role because they were considered to be too young at 28 or 29. So it works both ways. So I think us being much more open
Mm.
around this topic. When we only see age rather than contribution, we all lose out. It should be what people contribute. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing too that's really important that doesn't just get discussed is that we can't let the fact that we've got these extra 30 years, this longevity, only benefit those who've got the resources.
Yeah.
We really need to make sure that everyone in society can benefit from it. And one of the things that I think is really worrying, and I don't think we discuss enough, and governments don't want to discuss it because it would be a vote loser, but, state pensions are not enough for people to live on.
Mm.
And there are an awful lot of people who've not saved pensions or didn't save enough of their own pensions. And now we've got defined contribution where you have to manage your own pensions rather than it, the old way where the company had to kind of give it to you. A lot of people just don't have enough money, and a lot of people don't realize how long they're going to live, which tends to be longer than most people anticipate. And so I think we could really create a world where there is some wealthy people doing extremely well with longevity, and then a huge group of people who are really on the poverty line and really suffering. And again, what that does to society and how governments are going to cope with the health and pension needs of those people, I think is really quite worrying.
That's from a society point of view. For someone listening who's in the 55 or 65, thinking I need to reset my longevity strategy, where do they start? And any first step that isn't overwhelming for them.
Yeah, so I would actually say to people, even in your 50s, start thinking about what you want to do when you kind of like have left your corporate world. And I would get people to think about, you will have unique skills and talents that you have, but think about what are the skills or talents that you love to do, because those are your real strengths. And anything that you do in the future to feel fulfilled, you really need to use those strengths. So start thinking about them now. Start thinking about maybe creating a portfolio life. So what are things that you could be doing? Maybe again, you could start thinking about them now, even while you're in full-time work, that you might be able to do on a part-time basis in the future. I don't know. Maybe you've developed a lot of knowledge, and maybe you think you could mentor or coach people. So maybe you could start training to be a coach now, even though you're in full-time work. But start preparing for having a way of being that's more of a portfolio way of being. So lots of different things as opposed to one thing. I don't think you can start that early enough. Don't underestimate how long you're going to live. And so do plan for that. And also when thinking about your life, people tend to forget that, when you finish in the corporate world, you have a phase where you're fit and you're healthy and you can do all these great active things and travel and be very energetic. But then you're going to get into a kind of what I call the care span years, where you're not going to want to travel, you're going to have more health issues. And so you have this U curve. You spend a lot to start with. You then don't spend so much when you don't necessarily want to be travel around. And then the expense goes up again when your care needs become. So really think about that when it comes to thinking about your finances for that period too. And really focus on health, because health is the most important thing. And there's no point living longer if we don't have the health to go with it. And we all know it, but it's really doing something about it. And also make sure, as we've discussed earlier, you really invest in those social connections. Loneliness kills. We know that. It can be worse than smoking. And an awful lot of older people do live in isolation. And bizarrely, it can often be the very wealthy people that have the more issues, certainly in the West, maybe not so much in other parts of the world. But McKinsey did this fascinating study to show that some of the most wealthy people, particularly men, they become more isolated because, often they get divorced, or their partners have developed their own kind of like hobbies. Their children are dispersed around the world. And so many of their social connections were based on their senior role in an organization, and they get left behind.
Yeah.
And they just haven't developed those relationships and friendships, and they feel really isolated. So make sure you're not in that particular place either.
Lovely. We cannot conclude without talking about Stanford Center on longevity, because as an ambassador, I think you were there last week.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
So is there something exciting that's brewing in the space?
So what was interesting, so the Stanford Center on Longevity has an annual conference every year, and it's a different theme each year. And this year it was about lifelong learning in
Yeah.
particular, and also AI. So I think the three things actually that I took away from that was lifelong learning is something that we're all going to have to get used to. We're going to have to reskill many times over our lifetimes. And higher education really needs to change as well, because higher education has been, again, focused on young people coming in and doing a degree, and that's how they've kind of like made their money. They're going to need to adapt and become lifelong learning institutes as well. And a lot of people now actually who are coming up to leaving the corporate world are doing programs that higher education and universities are putting on. So a lot of the universities now are putting on programs to help people figure out what they're going to do next in their lives too, which I think is a really interesting model. So lifelong learning, absolutely critical. The second thing is that AI amplifies what makes us human, doesn't
Mhm.
detract from them. And that's something that, again, will actually make older people more valuable, because it is that wisdom, that judgment, and that needs to work hand in hand with AI for it to be really successful. And the two will need to work side by side. They're not just kind of like two separate things. And then the third thing that really came out was this need for complete systems change, that, the three-stage model isn't really fit for purpose anymore. So what are the new models and new systems that we need to be putting in place? And we didn't necessarily have all the answers, but it was definitely a consensus that these things needed to change.
A myth about life after 50 you'd like to bust.
I think is, again, this one, but the best is yet to come. It's not the best. The best years aren't behind you, and you can always learn new things.
Best is yet to come. Thank you so much for your thoughtful and energizing conversation, Annie. What really stands out for me is the idea that longevity isn't a problem to be solved, it's an opportunity to be designed. And I think another takeaway for me is that we no longer live life in neat chapters, as you said. We live in portfolios of learning, working, purpose, and contribution. And that definitely is an eye opener. So thank you once again for your time. Had a lovely time talking to you.
I've really enjoyed it, Maddie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.